What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Thursday, August 9th, 2018. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. We have a lot to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, and ready to answer the phone. Put you on the air with your comments and questions. Now, today is the 73rd anniversary of the atomic bombing of the city of Nagasaki. And over the last several years, it has basically emerged that the rationale that was given to the public for dropping the bombs really didn't hold up. Japan, as soon as Russia came on in to the war on Japan, Japan wanted to surrender. They were trying to surrender. And it wasn't really necessary to drop the bombs, but it appears that Truman did it basically to demonstrate we really had these things. And in a certain degree of cold cynicism, they just wanted to see what was going to happen to these cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was for that very reason that in the firebombing campaign against Japan that preceded the atomic bombs, the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were left alone so that they would be in pristine condition when the atomic bombs hit. So that's kind of what's going on in terms of that little bit of hidden history. And again, when you hear the corporate media talking about Iran's nukes or North Korea's nukes or Saddam's nukes or the rest of it, you need to remember the only nation that's ever actually used nuclear weapons of mass destruction against the civilians of another country is the United States of America. Now, the U.S. has just thrown more sanctions onto Russia, justifying them because of the poisoning of Sergei Skripal. And, of course, there's absolutely no proof Russia had anything to do with it. But, hey, we're the United States of America. We don't need any proof. We just have belief, and that's all it takes. So Russia is understandably upset. They're saying these new sanctions are unacceptable. And they reject, again, claims that they had anything to do with the Skripal case. And, again, Novichok was supposed to be this incredibly lethal chemical weapon, and yet it only killed 1 out of the 5 people who were exposed to whatever it was they were exposed to. Now, because of these impending sanctions, Russia is now threatening to ban the sale of rocket engines to the United States. The United States is still dependent on the Russian-made RD-180 rocket engine, which powers the first stage of the Atlas V rocket made by Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Now, there are American companies trying to come online and sort of regain the knowledge of how to build these very powerful rocket engines, but they're not ready yet. And so this would be a serious issue. I think these RD-180s are also used for some of the NASA spacecraft as well, including, if I recall correctly, the boosters that will launch these commercially made spacecraft made by SpaceX and Boeing up to the space station. So it's another escalation. And there doesn't really seem to be much point to it other than to just stir things up. And just stirring things up for the sake of stirring things up is generally a bad idea. Because the military-industrial complex wanted a new Cold War, and it looks like they've got it. So why keep pushing and risk a hot war? Now, down in Syria, 418 ISIS members have been killed in a Syrian Defense Force operation near the Iraq border. And apparently the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces released a statement summing up results of their operation in southern Al-Hasaka in eastern Deir ez-Zor. And so now these U.S.-backed groups are fighting against each other. And I think the U.S. is trying to justify its continued presence in Syria by backing the Syrian Defense Force and say, see, you need us to stay here. We got to stay here. But Syria doesn't want the U.S. there, The Syrian people doesn't want the U.S. there. The U.S. has no legal grounds to be there whatsoever. Basically, it's a foreign occupation of Syrian territory. There's no UN Security Council resolution that legalizes what the U.S. is doing in Syria. There's been no declaration of war against Syria from the Congress as required by the Constitution. So the U.S. is just clinging onto Syria so they don't have to admit that basically they lost this war and they got kicked out. Now, over in Iran, President Hassan Rouhani went on television to basically talk about the reinstatement of sanctions by the United States against his country. And he basically prepared his population for more hardship as a result of the sanctions, laying the blame where it really belongs here. And he responded to President Trump's offer of a meeting by saying, if you stab someone with a knife and then say you want to talk, the first thing you have to do is remove the knife. So what Rouhani is saying is that removing the sanctions is the first step before there are going to be any talks. Now, coming from the United States side, Trump is talking about the New Deal with Iran. And as we expected, it's not just the nuclear limits of the nuclear deal. Trump wants Iran to get rid of their long-range rockets because that's what Israel wants. But those long-range rockets are weapons of deterrence. So what Trump is asking Iran to do is to give up their weapons of deterrence and then just trust that the United States and Israel won't do anything, even though the United States has been caught multiple times playing the same game with other countries. Saddam gave up his chemical weapon arsenal. He never did have nuclear weapons on assurances by the United States that he would not be attacked. Then he got attacked. Same thing with Syria. Assad gave up his chemical weapons and then got invaded. So I can understand why Iran, not to mention North Korea, would be a little hesitant to take the U.S. government at their word. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. And here's an article that came out of Information Clearinghouse, and it's saying basically the same thing I've been saying over the last couple of weeks here. Trump's talk of isolating Iran speaks more to U.S. global isolation. And it says here, the move risks further isolating Washington, not Tehran, in the eyes of the world. And we're seeing Europe isn't going along with the sanctions. Europe is pulling away from the United States. China is going to buy Iranian oil. Turkey's going to buy Iranian oil. India apparently is caving into U.S. pressure, and they're going to buy some U.S. oil, along with some oil from Iran here. But again, this is exactly what's happening. You know, I was looking at Toynbee's theory of the collapse of civilizations, and he basically says civilizations collapse when their leadership falls in love with their own past, and they're oblivious to see new problems or seek creative solutions to deal with new problems. And they just keep playing the same thing over and over and over again, even when it becomes way out of date, which is a lot of what's happening here right now. Washington, D.C. is still acting like it's 1950 and 1960, where the U.S. reigns supreme. We're the indispensable country. We've got strong manufacturing and strong agriculture and a powerful economy. It isn't real. They're not seeing what is right in front of their eyes. And it's a warning sign. Now, yesterday we were talking about how a Spanish warplane taking part in a NATO exercise over Estonia had accidentally fired a live armed missile near the border with Russia. And I'd kind of just asked rhetorically on the air, I wonder where it went. Well, it turns out it traveled about 80 kilometers and hit a peat bog where it started a fire, and they put out the fire. They're searching for the missile fragments. So that's where it wound up, and I'm glad that's where it landed. It could have hit something a lot worse, like a hospital or a school here. Okay, so anyway, getting on back to India. Indian Oil Corporation, the biggest refiner in India, has purchased a total of 6 million barrels of U.S. crude oil for delivery between November and January, as it has started to look for a replacement of Iranian oil cargoes ahead of the U.S. sanctions. So India did back down. Down in Nicaragua, their president is blasting the U.S. foreign policy, saying the U.S. isn't seeking normal relations with any other country. What's going on is the U.S. is demanding total submission, even servility. And President Daniel Ortega is out there saying U.S. foreign policy is based on expansionism and oppression. Neocolonialism, if you want. And he said, we have always wanted to have normal relations with the U.S., but we see only aggression in return. Well, welcome to the club. Welcome to the club. Basically, that's Washington's foreign policy. Just stomp on anybody who refuses to bow down to Washington, D.C.'s will. Over in Venezuela, they've now released evidence tying the Maduro assassination to Colombia and to the United States. This backs up that journalist, James Bliley, over in Peru, who said that the drones were actually purchased in Miami, flown to Colombia, taken across the border into Venezuela. The explosives were attached and made to look like TV news cameras, and the attempt was made. But it failed because of anti-drone technology protecting President Maduro here. Over in Taiwan, satellite imagery being published by the Kanwa Defense Review shows Taiwan has positioned a land attack cruise missile aimed toward mainland China that is capable of targeting several cities along the country's southeast coast. So these are the Xiangfeng 2E land attack cruise missile. They're stationed at a base in Toyun, less than 200 miles from Fuzhou, the capital city of China's Fujian province. And apparently the pictures were actually taken this year back in March, but they're only just now being released. So yet another place where tensions are cranking. Is it just me, or does it feel like the whole world is going crazy? All of our leaders are just war happy. They think war is a great thing. They can't wait to just get on out there. They think it's going to be great. They're going to, have statues, erected in their honor. They're going to get their faces on the currency and the postage stamps. A pregnant 23-year-old Palestinian, Inas Muhammad Kamash, was killed along with her daughter Bayan, 1.5 years old. The woman's husband was moderately injured. Israel is doing this supposedly in response to another missile attack from Gaza into Israel, which, like all the other supposed missile attacks, just didn't hit anything. Okay. Now, the National Board for Planning and Building has recommended to the government of Israel construction of 2 new communities in the Negev desert. And so that's probably going to go ahead. So once again, Israel is just out there building these settlements, despite condemnation from the world. Now, interestingly enough, as you know, one of the big problems that came out of Israel's massacre of the Palestinians at the fence with Gaza was that Israel would not allow the wounded Gazans to go to the West Bank to better equipped Palestinian hospitals where their wounds could be treated. And as a result, many of these people had their legs amputated. Well, the EU has come on down saying that there really ought to be a rail line, a link between Gaza and the West Bank, because after all, they're all Palestinians, and of course, Israel has flatly rejected that idea. Israel's goal is to keep breaking Palestine into smaller and smaller pieces so they can never be a contiguous block of land to house a future Palestinian state. Now, Israel's still going back and forth over their new draft law, and of course, the big issue there is the Orthodox Jews' view of Judaism says they're not allowed to participate in war. And Israel, for the longest time, has exempted the Orthodox Jews from the draft law. Now Israel wants to change that, and it's led to quite a bit of tension. So the existing Israeli Defense Service law expires in September after the High Court of Justice deemed it unconstitutional. So the Knesset is obliged to pass an alternative law before then. All right, we're going to take a phone call from Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha, Dustin. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, what happened to the infrastructure plan of this country from Trump? He's more interested in building a space force. $8 million or $8 billion.
Oh, it's going to be
Why
billions.
isn't that money being used?
Space is expensive. Yeah, the infrastructure is not. I mean, they did allocate a small amount of money for infrastructure improvement, but it's nowhere near enough. In fact, it's just a drop in the bucket. It's largely symbolic, and I don't know where it's being spent. It's certainly not being spent around here.
You know, Mike, I keep hearing from Trump people, you know, because I flow through the Fox News crap also, like the economy is doing well, and we're at like this percentage of unemployment, and I say BS with all of that, because you see what's going on in Europe, Mike, with the food banks. They're telling them not to log in the amount of people applying for the food bank.
Yeah,
well,
they're
if that's
trying to
going
hide
on there,
that.
it's going on here. Yeah, yep, and then that tells you there's a lot more people either that's on unemployment and looking for help because it's not as good as they're claiming, you know. But it's a welfare to warfare state now, our country. And the West, it seems like that's what the West, you know, that's why Trump wants to increase NATO spending and all that. This is what we got left. My God, Mike, this is it. I mean, it blows my mind how, like, I want people to call in your show if they still support Trump. I'm sorry, but like, there should have been $8 billion for infrastructure rebuilding, not for a space force. I mean, what's the point? You know, I mean, Russia cut back their military spending from 62 to 45, and they're going to use the money in between to put it into infrastructure and stuff. You know, but we're not doing that.
No,
but yet we can print money out of thin air. You know, but we can print money out of thin air.
Yeah, well, it's not out of thin air. It's basically a debt that future generations of Americans will be enslaved to. And, you know, and I'm sure the thinking in Washington, D.C. is we're going to conquer all those other countries and we're going to let them pay our debt off. But remember when we were told that the revenues from Iraq's oil would pay for that war and the reconstruction? It didn't happen.
Yeah, look at what we did to Libya. Yeah, that was a disaster because they made it. You think they actually intentionally making these disasters? Everybody says, oh, it was like they screwed up. No, maybe they didn't screw up. Maybe it's all intentionally to cripple these countries, you know, you know what I mean? Do you think that's a possibility that they're intentionally reducing these countries to rubble?
Well, certainly that would be Israel's interest. Israel wants to be basically dominate the Middle East, and all of these other countries that might present a political rivalry have to be smashed up. That's what they did in Iraq, and that's why Israel's pushing so hard for this war with Iran, or for regime change in Iran.
Mike, I want to switch gears if I still got time to the opioid crisis in the United States.
Yeah, I'm going to take you through the commercial break.
Okay. Yeah, there was a report a woman gave birth in a Burger King while she's high on heroin. So, like,
oh, man.
We have an opioid crisis. But Mike, I know some of I don't know if you believe in, like, just allowing all drugs to be legal, but people need to look up the opioid crisis in China. You know, like, it'll reduce your country to nothing.
Yes.
You know? Yes. I mean, it can be used as a weapon. So I want people to keep that in mind, you know, instead of saying we should make all drugs legal. I mean, marijuana is one thing, but, I mean, you got to draw the line somewhere, you know, because heroin's pretty nasty stuff. You know, and you can see what's going on in the...
It's pouring out of Afghanistan and into the streets of America and into our pharmaceutical industries. Anyway, Dustin, stay on the line. Got to put you on hold here. We're going to take a commercial break, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And once again, we're standing here with our hands outstretched here and asking for your support for Republic Broadcasting, because you can see it yourself. We're under attack. The entire independent media is under attack. They started with Alex Jones, and now they're spreading on out. We're going to be talking about that a lot later in the show. And, you know, sooner or later, they're going to get down to a small fry. And we need your help to stay on the air and keep trying to get the truth out. So if you can help, and remember, there's no such thing as too small a donation. The postal address to send a check, money order, or if you prefer anonymity, cash, is Republic Broadcasting Network, 2251 Double Creek Road, number 302, Round Rock, Texas, 78664. The phone number where you can make a credit or debit card donation or pledge to be a recurring subscriber is 800-724-2719, extension 1 during business hours, extension 3 at all other times. Okay, getting on back to Dustin in New Jersey. Maybe Trump's plan to make America great again is not to lift America up, but to just smash the rest of the world down, so that in a relativistic sense, America is the greatest nation on earth again.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem is he's going to smash down all the... People don't realize parts are coming in from China to be used in American products also, that are made here. So, I mean, you're going to ruin the rest of the world, you're going to ruin this country. At the same time, I mean, I just... you know, China, they are not... They're playing a long game. You know, they're not, I mean, they might have some short-term pain like we are, but they will come out in the long run because they have the world, they got 85% of the world's manufacturing. We don't. They can go to other places. We can't. That's what people don't realize. You know, I mean, I think it's a disaster. I mean, and he's going to be increasing it more and more because he thinks he's winning.
Yeah.
You know, Washington thinks they're winning. I mean, I mean, this could lead to a Great Depression on the planet, and it'll be worse here because everybody expects everything for them here because we're a welfare and a warfare state. So I think it'd be worse here than anywhere else in the world, just because we don't make anything anymore. And you know,
I've read several articles by analysts who are saying that this next crash is going to be worse than the Depression of the 1930s. And that's not something I want anybody to have to live through. But it looks like at this point it's unavoidable. The debt is simply too great. It's unsustainable. And, you know, both the Republicans and the Democrats like to spend like crazy to keep their constituents happy. And, you know, the ordinary American, we've run out of money. And so there's nothing really to repay all that debt with.
And they just put more sanctions on Russia, like you said. I'm like, and did you see what they did to Rand Paul when he went over there with the letter to Putin? They called him a traitor. And then now you got, did you hear about Facebook and the Atlantic Council, which is an arm of NATO? They're going to be teaming up to censor news that they don't like. I mean, we've become authoritarian in the West.
Yes,
I mean,
we
this
have.
is corporatism.
Yes, we have.
Yeah,
I mean, this open and blatant censorship basically is the red flag that we have basically descended into fascism.
Bro, in all the wars, Mike, the tariffs, like you said, there's some crazy crap going on all around the world. People better be scared and wake the heck up because all this stuff going on at the same time is not a good mix, you know?
No, it isn't.
And, Mike, that's all I got to say.
All right, well, thanks an awful lot here. Thanks for the phone call here. And I've got another caller waiting on the line, but I'm going to wait until after the commercial break. Turning on back to Israel, there was a mass protest in Israel over the nation-state law. And we're talking tens of thousands of people in Tel Aviv just protesting against the law. They were holding signs, if we are brothers, we must be equals, our forces are unity, and they were waving Israeli and Druze flags. And leaving the Druze out of the nation-state law, I think, was probably Netanyahu's single biggest mistake. But you probably ought to click on that link and take a look at the photograph, because that square where the protest is taking place, it is simply jammed. It is jammed. Now, satellite images are showing that North Korea is continuing to dismantle the missile launch site, but there are no signs of any moves to scrap the nuclear weapons. I'm sure what North Korea is doing right now is they're waiting for a sign of good faith from the United States. And if Mike Pompeo and John Bolton have their way, it's not going to come. Because their attitude is, you do what we want first. and then maybe we'll do something nice for you. North Korea, returned those remains. They're dismantling the missile launch site. They've stopped nuclear testing. They've stopped missile testing. It's time for the U.S. to step up and say, okay, here's a reciprocal action. But that's not how the U.S. government operates. All right, we're going to take another break for commercials. When we come on back, we have another caller waiting on the phones. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. And boy, we got a lot of callers waiting on the line here. So let's start with Jim in Chicago. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What is on your mind?
Hello, Michael. I have a question. When did Ron Paul become Donald Trump's delivery boy? Why is he doing that?
Probably just, loyalty within the party, or maybe Ron Paul is hoping that he's going to gain something out of it.
Well, normally, isn't it normal that if the president wanted to send a letter to an official overseas or the head of a country, you go through the State Department?
That would be normal, and I think it was Rand Paul who delivered the letter, and I don't know that the letter came directly from Donald Trump. But it's true, though, that when Rand Paul went to Russia and delivered the letter, and by the way, that's kind of a ritual thing to basically show this is important. This is direct communication. It's on paper, and it's a way of basically signaling the gravitas of what's in there. But they did call him a traitor and just excoriated him. Right now, the corporate media, anybody who says anything nice about Russia, or even who says, let's just go back to being friends with Russia, they're attacked. There is this get Russia mentality throughout the government and the corporate media. And personally, I think we ought to grab all these people, give them parachutes, and drop them into the middle of Moscow if they're that hot and bothered to go to war with Russia.
Right. I am not anti-Russian, but I thought it's kind of unusual that a president would give it to a senator instead of going through the diplomatic channel. That was my
I think it was a way of signaling it was more important, and also Donald Trump may realize that he still has people in the State Department he cannot trust. There may have been a communication in that letter that he thought should remain confidential.
Okay, and my final point, did you read in the paper today where Puerto Rico is sending 4,000 of their prisoners to the mainland? And who's going to pay for that? And how could they do that?
Apparently, they got whichever prisons are accepting them. For all we know, it may be some of these privatized prison factories who just need more workers.
Well, that's a good point, because I said to myself, Puerto Rico's broke, and they said they're doing it because they can't take care of them. So where's the money going to come up for to pay off these prisons for these prisoners?
Obviously, it's going to come somehow, some way from the pockets of Americans, either people who are buying the products coming out of the prison factories, or it'll come out of the taxpayer funds.
Right. Okay, Michael, you take care.
All right, well, thanks an awful lot, and we're going to switch on over to Helen in Pennsylvania. Aloha, Helen. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Good evening, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
I'm listening to RBN, and all the confusion with everybody's being or having that fear in them about this war and rumors of wars and all the commotion and the fighting and the turmoil going on. It's a disgrace. Nobody is going to push a button. People should be concentrating on preparing their homes or wherever they live for natural disasters that are going to happen, and they've been brewing. Arizona's under the Grand Canyon, they're going to have that volcano explode. It will change the geography of the United States of America.
Well,
and many other places.
There's a very thin line, and I think you mean the Yellowstone supervolcano. There's a very thin line between prepping for natural disasters and prepping for war, and we talk about prepping a lot on this show. And fortunately for us here on Oahu, Hurricane Harvey is already passed. We got very little wind, very little rain. So we lucked out on that one. But yeah, in most cases, prepping for a possible war is very much like prepping for a natural disaster. As far as the Yellowstone supervolcano, there's no amount of prepping that is going to save people who are living right next to Yellowstone. It's going to be that powerful. And obviously, there's no amount of prepping that will save you if you are the target of a nuclear attack.
Oh, absolutely. And Tennessee is heading for a terrible earthquake, and they have no preparation for it. California does.
Well, if you're talking about the New Madrid fault, if you're talking about the New Madrid fault, people in the area are aware of it, and I'm sure probably that there are a lot of people who are prepping, if not for the quake, they're prepping for tornadoes and hurricanes, which hit the region. I think more people are into prepping than you give them credit for.
Right. Well, I'm happy to hear that. And also, I have a health tip. There shouldn't be one home without powdered cayenne pepper or Frank's hot sauce in a jar in the fridge or icebox or whatever. And also coconut oil to have in for emergencies. And but the cayenne pepper mix, I have a teaspoon with a half a cup of hot water and ingest it. You will pull yourself out of a cardiac arrest before any ambulance in any part of the world can pick you up. God bless America and other parts of the world. And Mike, I'm listening to your show and enjoying it.
Well, thank you very much for the advice, and thank you very much for the kind words. We're going to let you go and switch over to Joe in Tennessee. Aloha, Joe. Thank you for waiting. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I read a great article this morning about farmers in South Africa, and how everybody, they're being victimized by the black government, and they're having their farms confiscated. But the interesting part about this article was it said these farmers weren't just sitting around waiting to have their lands confiscated. They did kind of what I did in Florida, which was spread the pain. In other words, they are mortgaged out. They have big loans from the banks on these on their property.
Yes.
So what I think the government in South Africa is realizing is if they confiscate these farms from these Dutch farmers, Boers, it's going to cause a banking crisis, which I find really funny because a lot of these communist governments like the ANC and such, they're actually funded by, the banking interests because they like the communist kind of governments because they give them control over a lot of the resources and stuff.
Yes.
So it's kind of ironic to see, these statists and these communists and even these bankers, because they love like a one-party state, to see that these free market type farmers have outsmarted them in a sense, in that it's like a poison pill. It's going to make it very difficult. Not only are the people there going to starve when they force these farmers off their property because they will no longer be productive, there's going to be a lot of bank problems caused by this.
Yeah,
and,
it's Zimbabwe all over again. The same thing happened in Zimbabwe. They took the farms away from the white farmers who knew how to run a farm. They gave them to the black people who really didn't know what they were doing. And the farms stopped producing. There was hunger. And again, as you say, these properties had mortgages on them that were not being repaid. Now, the government of South Africa may simply arbitrarily declare that the farmers are still responsible for the mortgages, but they're not going to have the money to pay for it without having a working farm. So I'm not surprised so many of them are taking Putin up on his offer for free land up in Russia. And a lot of them have already basically gotten out. They probably sold their farms to somebody or simply abandoned them. And they've gone up to Russia. They're going to get free land. They're going to start new farms there. And they're not going to have to deal with this nonsense.
Yeah, no, I think that's what's happening, and I'm all for the farmers. I love to see statists getting punched in the nose, and I like to see individuals who figure a way to stick it to the system, and I hope that this does that in effect. Oh, I wanted to answer the one guy who was talking about Trump and how we could still be supporting Trump, especially with this China thing. And Trump ran on being hard on China. He ran on he was going to try to get manufacturing back from China. I mean, we have a $500 billion a year deficit with China, so I agree with Trump that I think that it's a win-win for us, that we can we're a big market for their products. They're not buying our products. So
we don't make anything they want. That's where Trump's plan has fallen apart. Okay? You heard that other caller. China has 85% of the world's manufacturing capacity. And the United States, starting about 30, I guess going on 40 years ago, basically abandoned manufacturing. And we just don't have the factories right now to come up with domestic equivalent products. I know some companies are trying to start up, but it's going to be a very, very long process. And what Trump really should have done was take all this money that's being spent on the Space Force and some of the wars, along with the illegal immigrants and the refugees, and basically set up a government program to fund manufacturing development.
Well, an infrastructure. I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that. And the infrastructure plan, I would have liked to have seen that. But, I mean, I like the fact that he's started this with China, and I think that a lot of manufacturing can be restarted in this country. Look at the steel, and they're hiring, and people in Michigan are hiring for the auto companies. So a lot of manufacturing, it doesn't take that much to really restart it. We do have a lot of office space and factory space, and I think that they're going to be the ones that are going to lose most if this doesn't come to an end. And the other thing I'd like to talk about is Trump with prison reform. I mean, Obama almost doubled Americans' prison population over his presidency, and I see Trump on TV now, and they're talking about trying to get people out and get them back to work. And I mean, we have a lot of nonviolent drug offenders in prison, and it makes me sick.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that one.
Violent people.
Here's the problem. There are no jobs for those prisoners. We know that the unemployment figures are a lie. Paul Craig Roberts came out with a really good article about it just a few days ago, where he said you cannot have this claim of ultra low unemployment while looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics job worker participation rate and the fact that wages and salaries are still in the basement. Normally, when you've got very, very low unemployment, there's going to be pressure on wages and salaries to go up. We're not seeing it. And so, the problem is if you let these prisoners out of the prison, and I agree, the nonviolent drug offenders ought to be let go, especially the people in there for marijuana. But what are they going to do?
Infrastructure plan.
Well, who's going to come up with the money? See, that's the missing component.
They come up with the money from the wars. You're right. I mean, we end the wars and we build the infrastructure and we let the prisoners out of prison. How's that? I mean, it makes sense, but it's probably politically very difficult to do.
Right now, politically, it's impossible. I mean, a lot of what Trump said sounded really good, but his implementation has fallen short. And again, the main reason I supported Donald Trump in 2016 was I didn't want Hillary Clinton in that Oval Office because things would be a lot worse than they are now. But he has been a disappointment, and I'm willing to basically acknowledge that I see him as a tremendous disappointment. And he's got a lot of people around him giving him bad advice. And his biggest single mistake coming into the White House was that he wanted to be magnanimous in victory, and he let all the Obama holdovers stay there, thinking that because he was now the boss, they would be loyal to him. That's how it works in business. That is not how it works in Washington, D.C. Trump should have just cleaned out the White House and the executive office building and brought in all new people from outside the Beltway who are not compromised by that dark core of corruption inside the heart of the deep state.
Well, I agree with you on that, but at the same time, I really think Trump is shaking things up, and I'm glad. I'm glad we have somebody shaking things up.
He's done that.
That's worth the price of admission.
Well, shaking things up is not always a good thing, as anybody who tries to open a soft drink on a hot day will tell you that. Anyway, listen, Joe, we're going to let you go and switch over to Steve Elkins. Aloha, Steve. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, what is the possibility there's a plan actually to take out the independent media first prior to an economic collapse? Because if there's an economic collapse and independent media is installed, it's still there doing really strong, it'll get even stronger because the people will definitely leave the mainstream media and flock towards the independent media for answers because we were telling the truth. We were talking about the true economic situation, what was really going on. I think that might be a plan. They wanted to take out independent first and then maybe let it collapse.
I don't think it's a case of letting it collapse. They can't stop it from happening. And I don't think it's just the economy. There's a lot of overlapping agendas to this attack on the independent media. The vaccine companies want us silenced. The GMO companies want us silenced. Corporate media wants to get rid of their competition. The government basically is very frustrated that they can't lie us into going along with their agenda, because every time they do a false flag or they lie about the war, it's ripped apart here in the independent media. Because of the independent media, the lifespan of a government lie can be clocked with an egg timer these days.
I also want to say thank you for that third hour from your guest yesterday, Alan Phillips. I went out today, did a little bit of shopping on my day off, and I carefully approached a woman who had a autistic child. Actually, she was the grandmother taking care of him for today. He was probably 14, 15 years old, and I had to be careful how I word this, but I talked to her, and she was actually very compliant and gave me all the the updates of actually when he became, they realized he was autistic at the age of 18 months after a series of vaccines.
Yep.
And I turned her on to, of course, RBN and what we've been talking around here, and I told her definitely Alan Phillips' website. But we may get a new listener to the network, and hopefully she'll tell a lot of the people. But this is what I'm finding out. I'm going to start doing this a little bit more often. I hope I don't have any blowback on this, but approach people in a skillful way, and then talk to them and see if I can get more information. But she said at 18 months old, he was fine up until 18 months. Came in, went in for the baby shots, came back, started having different behaviors, this and this, and he's in pretty bad shape as far as autism goes if you had to scale it. And I don't know, Mike, this is I've got 5 grandchildren. I'm fighting hard to stop all this mandatory, but they really are twisting arms, and even at work. Yeah, saying if you don't comply, people are losing their jobs as a nurse or wherever they're working. And I don't know.
They weren't happy just making the money off of vaccinating children. Now they want to get the adults mandatory vaccines because that will enlarge the market. It means more money. Steve, do you have more? Do you want to stay through the commercial break?
No, that's it. That's fine. That's all right.
Thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go, and we'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, we had a caller into the show yesterday who talked about this subject, and I found some more information about it. And apparently, there is a problem with the fabrication of the vertical launch tubes that are being used in 3 different classes of submarine. And they're saying the delay to rebuild these missile tubes could delay the completion of the submarines. Now, these missile tubes were going to be used in the next version of the U.S. Navy's Virginia-class attack submarines, the Block 5, as well as the upcoming Columbia-class and the British Royal Navy's Dreadnought class, which are both ballistic missile submarines. And apparently a dozen of these tubes manufactured by BWXT Inc. were found to have substandard wells. Now, obviously on a submarine or any ship, the wells have to be absolutely perfect. These vertical launch tubes have to withstand the pressures of the missiles being launched from them, followed by the inrush of seawater, and you can't have the wells breaking. They have to perform over and over and over again. So it's just another reminder that what's coming out of the U.S. military-industrial complex is very costly, but not really very good here. The U.S. military is now spending roughly $500 million training for underground warfare. And basically the Army has decided the next war which may be against peer competitors like Russia, China, or North Korea. Well, North Korea is not a peer, let's be honest about that. Will probably involve a great deal of underground fighting, because many of the world's most powerful militaries maintain vast subterranean facilities built to house command units, shield forces from nuclear or conventional attack, and to deliver unsuspecting sneak attacks on forces above ground. One estimate last year places the number at 10,000 worldwide. Well, this is nothing new. If you go back and you study the history of World War II, there was a lot of military tunneling going on. So, but any more excuse to spend other people's money. All right, let's take a quick phone call from Layla in Ontario. Aloha, Layla, and I'm probably going to have to take you to station identification. What's on your mind today?
Yes, Mike, I noticed in your earlier comments you were talking about the massive protest in Israel and that it was Israelis as well as the Druze.
Yes.
Who were protesting.
Yep.
What I regret is that they haven't included other groups. Now, the thing that's unique about the Druze is that they don't consider...
We don't know what other groups may have been there. It was just the Israeli and Druze flags. There may have been Palestinians there, right. That didn't get caught by the photographer, although Palestinians able to get into Tel Aviv would be very, very difficult. But I agree with you.
There's something about the Druze too that's unique. I don't know how much you know about them. One can never marry into the Druze. You only
Layla,
marry a fellow Druze.
Layla, I'm going to put you on hold. We got to do a station identification. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. So stay on the line. We'll be right back. And Aloha America, welcome back to our show, hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, and we're talking with Layla in Ontario about this massive protest in Tel Aviv against the nation-state law, which involves Israelis who are Jewish, and the Druze as well. And the reaction from Jews all over the world to this law has been, for the most part, negative, because it basically advertises that Israel is, in fact, an apartheid country. And a lot of Jews around the world are very concerned that Israel's actions are reflecting badly on Jews everywhere. And because of Israel's constant efforts to blur the line between what Israel is doing and the world's Jews, they're all feeling like they're being potentially set up to be a target here. And you were going to give us a little information about the Druze.
Very unique kind of people. They're very ancient. And they have always been very exclusive. Nobody can become a Druze. You're either born a Druze, you cannot work or join. And once you marry a non-Druze, you're essentially excommunicated from the group. They have always lived in the mountaintops of the areas of whatever was Israel or is Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and they've all usually, their leader was Jumblat, and I don't know if he's still alive and still their leader, but it is a very exclusive group, and they were easily, because they've survived, because they've always been loyal to whichever group was the ruling autocracy or dominant party within any of the countries within which they lived. They never engaged in political activism against the ruling parties, and therefore they were included and given high office. And yes. I'm sure you remember the name Moshe Dayan.
Yes.
My family, my parents were friends with his first wife, Ruth Dayan, and I remember her bragging about how, the Druze are so loyal to us in Israel. They're judges, they're academics, they're doctors. We give them all the opportunities because they're loyal to us. So essentially they were being used, and because of that, some of them have been resented by the non-Druze. They're not really Muslim, but they are similar to Islam. Now, there have been a few Druze that have refused to serve in the Israeli army, saying that they consider the Palestinians their brothers, yes, and would not fight their own people. We don't hear what happened to them. We only hear about the Druze success story. Now, with regard to the non-Jews in Israel, I would imagine the non-Jews of non-Palestinian origin might be protesting. There might be a small minority of Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship who might be part of that protest, but I suspect they'd be afraid then of suffering repercussions. However, the fact that thousands have turned out is a wonderful, wonderful sign that gives me great hope. And that also gives me hope that the Jews worldwide in the diaspora will now see what Israel really is.
Yes.
So it's a wonderful event, and I just hope that things like this continue, and eventually people like Avigdor Lieberman, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the really hardliners are finally forced out. One final comment. I did notice through Ruth, Diane, that many of the original founders of the State of Israel were beginning to suffer conscience pangs. That's why Rabin tried to make peace with Yasser Arafat. And I think we could even see that towards the end in Shimon Peres before he died. They began to realize, and Ezer Weitzman, I know, he too, who was the brother-in-law of Ruth Diane, he also began to express regrets over what the early Zionists had done. So, today, to all you Jews, look back on the history of Israel and see why, if the founding pioneers were suffering regrets, maybe you should reconsider whether your loyalty really is to Israel or to Judaism. So that's my last comment, Michael.
Well, that's a good comment there. That's a good comment. And I get a lot of positive emails about you.
Well, thank you for that. And I just wanted to comment, I'm amazed at your stamina to be able to go 3 hours, 5 days a week, and still be able to speak is astounding. You are truly someone that deserves support, and I hope that all of those, whether they call in and participate in this show, I hope everybody continues to support RBN and you with donations. So take care, keep up the good work, and be well. Bye for now.
Do the best that I can here. And yeah, after about 3 hours on the microphone, my brains do get a little fluffy here. And of course, there's like 4 hours of show prep before the 3 hours. So this is actually a full-time job. This is a full-time job. Anyway, Layla, thank you very much. We're going to let you go here. The phone lines are now open, and we're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are rejoining our network here. Okay, getting on back to issues of war and related things. Apparently, a Royal Air Force airwoman had her Tinder profile hacked by spies. And the spies attempted, they basically stole her identity, pretended to be her, and tried to basically sweet talk colleagues, people who wanted to get close to this woman, into revealing secrets about the F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter. And apparently this happened just last month. And they basically stole her identity. They were connecting with colleagues, hoping to find at least one who worked with the F-35. That basically failed. And the woman noticed her profile had been hacked and informed her bosses immediately. None of the people who were caught up in this cyber honey trap worked on the F-35. So the spy effort basically fell on its face here. Speaking of spies, over in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, they've caught a Russian spy there. And apparently she's been there for over a decade, was cunningly disguised as a Russian. And it sort of makes you wonder how they vet these people, because apparently this woman had actually been hired by the U.S. Secret Service. So, anyway. All righty, getting on to our domestic political situation here. Christina Layla for the Gateway Pundit is saying, look for Trump to declassify the June 2017 Carter Page visa renewal this month. And again, it's going to be potentially hugely embarrassing to the FBI. Now, as you know, the Senate has sent an invitation to Julian Assange to have a closed-door meeting to talk to him about Russian hacking at a time and place of their mutual convenience. In other words, they're understanding right now there's no way for him to come to Washington, D.C. So it sounds like they're getting ready to go to London. And again, the Democrats are just totally freaking out because his testimony could destroy this whole conspiracy theory that Russia hacked the DNC. That's been the core of this whole Russia collusion fantasy for a year and a half. And Assange has already said through his lawyer it wasn't Russia. And he did drop a serious hint, without naming the actual name, that it was Seth Rich. And he was talking about the dangers of being a whistleblower and a leaker. And he said, you know, recently we had somebody who was just killed, and that was Seth Rich. And everybody said, okay, there's the confirmation. Not really, it's not ironclad, but that's what everybody is pretty much thinking here. Now, we know because of the metadata on the DNC files, it wasn't a hack, because the timestamps on the files are too fast for them to have gone out over the internet. They were copied onto a high-speed flash drive inside the DNC offices and just walked out the door. And again, that points to Seth Rich. Over at Judicial Watch, they filed a motion to file an amicus curiae brief, friend of the court brief, regarding the unsealing of the documents of IRS officials like Lois Lerner and Holly Paz, looking into that targeting of conservative organizations by the IRS. So Judicial Watch is just out there doing really, really good work. Up in New York, something interesting has happened. There was a request for a copy of everything on Anthony Weiner's laptop. It was filed under New York's Freedom of Information law, which is the state version of the Freedom of Information Act at the national level. But the NYPD is denying to make that information available. And they really didn't have an explanation. Now, there's no ongoing investigation because Anthony Weiner's already gone to jail for his sexting crimes. But it kind of makes you wonder, is there something else on that laptop the deep state does not want to get on out? Apparently, yesterday, Antifa invaded the Portland City Hall and created violence, attacking innocent people, injuring them. Arrests were made. And interestingly enough, the media reports on this tried to make it look like it was the police that attacked Antifa. And it wasn't. They started the whole ruckus. We've seen that repeatedly. Every time Antifa goes on in and violently confronts somebody they don't like, the media will say, oh, well, the Trump supporters started it. The police started it. Antifa, they're just sweet little angels. They would never do anything like this here. We were talking the other day about how Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk had just been sitting in a restaurant having breakfast when they got harassed by a bunch of thugs from Antifa. And remember, this is the kind of behavior Maxine Waters has been encouraging people to do. And again, the optics were really, really bad. Candace is a known name, drew a lot of attention to the fact that this kind of harassment's going on. So Chris Hahn went on TV and basically said that he thinks Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk faked the Antifa attack on themselves as a cheap publicity trick. Well, I don't think Candace needed the publicity. And I think this individual is just trying to trivialize and dismiss what happened. Again, because the optics are bad. And the more Antifa behaves like this, remember, they're solidly linked with the liberal Democrats in the minds of the voters. And we're coming up on the midterm elections. And the primaries are not indicating that there's going to be a blue wave. And the more Antifa behaves like this, the more the liberals just get out there with this insane political correctness. It's turning off American voters. Now, here's a very interesting story. Apparently, down in West Virginia, their entire Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, is facing impeachment. And apparently, one of the justices, Justice Minas Ketchum, resigned his job last month and pled guilty on a federal charge of wire fraud. But what we're seeing here is this atmosphere of entitlement and cavalier disregard for the expenditure of taxpayer money. And the entire court seems to be infected by that atmosphere. And so the West Virginia's House Judiciary Committee basically said they had to take action. The entire state Supreme Court looking at impeachment. Is government corrupt? Yeah, I think so. Now, Pennsylvania Democrats are now offering Steelers memorabilia in exchange for voter registration. Or if you want the really good memorabilia, switch parties. They're literally trying to bribe voters to switch parties. That's really getting on out there and getting desperate here. Okay. Apparently in the Ohio election, which was deeply contested, all of a sudden a whole patch of uncounted votes was found. Oh my goodness, how could we have missed these? And to nobody's surprise, they helped the Democrat. All I got to do is find one more box of, oh my goodness, we missed these ballots, and the Democrats will steal that election. It's what they do. But thankfully, the judge, a judge, has basically ended the so-called consent decree, and now the GOP is free to investigate allegations of election fraud, and they better get on out there and start doing it here. Meanwhile, Bill Nelson is out there screaming the Russians have penetrated some voter registration systems in Florida. And what's interesting is within the article itself, it says the Florida Department of State has received zero information from Senator Nelson or his staff that support the claims. And additionally, the department has received no information from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that corroborates Senator Nelson's statement. We have no evidence to support the claims. Gee, you think the senator's lying? Just amazing out there. Now, as you know, Chris Collins got arrested, and because he's a Republican, the corporate media gave him a lot of coverage. And there was this article that came out of Newsbusters basically saying that the corporate media just gave him a lot of airtime on the story. Oh, bad GOP, bad GOP. But at the same time, charges of corruption against Democrats are played down or simply ignored. Now let's take a look at Elizabeth Warren. They are finally now admitting, even the liberal media is admitting, that Elizabeth Warren lied about her Native American ancestry. And for years, Elizabeth Warren pretended to be an Indian. She lied about being part Indian to jump over qualified minority candidates and land a position at Harvard University. Warren was listed as Harvard Law's first woman of color in 1997. Law Review, Peace on Diversity and Affirmative Action. She's lied about her heritage for years. She has no links to any American Indians. That's why she kept refusing to take a DNA test. It was all a lie. Finally, even the corporate media had to come on out and say, okay, yeah, all right, all right. Yeah, she's not Indian. It's amazing here. All right, let's talk about the economic news here. America's going bankrupt. Americans are going bankrupt. Bankruptcies are soaring as the U.S. grapples with an unprecedented debt problem. The national debt is way out of control. Consumer bankruptcies are surging. Corporate debt has doubled since the last financial crisis. State and local government debt loads have never been higher, and the federal government has been adding more than $1 trillion a year to the federal debt ever since Barack Obama entered the White House. The country's on a debt binge. And it's being used basically to fund the wars and all the money going to Israel. It's not improving our lifestyles, by the way. It really, really isn't. And we've been saying for years, you know, pay off your credit cards. You know, get yourself out of debt. Pay cash or do without. Those credit cards are not your friend here. Now, Jacob Rothschild is out there voicing his concern about the global financial system that was established after World War II. And he's pointing to the U.S.-China trade war and Eurozone crisis as key problems putting economic order at risk. I love that name, the order. Now, the Rothschild dynasty is heavily invested in a Western-centric global economic order. That's why he's making the reference to end of World War II, Bretton Woods. But that is starting to falter as the world learns to get along without the U.S. and Europe. And that's exactly and that's what Rothschild is worried about. So we're going to take another break for commercials, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we're talking about the economic news and the escalation with China. And Trump is about to do something that is really going to ratchet up the tension between the two countries. Apparently, there's a report from the New York Post, according to which the Trump administration, as part of a crackdown on certain U.S. investments made by Chinese companies in the United States, is set to seize a majority stake in 850 3rd Avenue. The stake is owned by HNA, which is this Chinese conglomerate whose chairman died in a freak accident in Italy 1 month ago. The U.S. partner in the building is desperate to save it. But just grabbing assets like that, what's going to happen to American-owned assets in China after that? Man. We were talking earlier about Elon Musk, who really rattled the markets and shocked a lot of people when he came out with an announcement that he is taking Tesla private and that he's got the funding to do it. And it's going to take a huge amount of money because despite Tesla's problems, the company valuation is still very high. The stock was trading at about $450 a share when trading was stopped. But the former chair of the Securities Exchange Commission is out there saying that if it is found that he doesn't have the financing at the time that he put out that tweet about taking Tesla private, he could face civil and criminal penalties. There are some times when I'm starting to wonder if Elon Musk is starting to lose it. And I mean, he's just doing all these different things, and I'm sure he's enjoying himself immensely, except for the problems with Tesla. But we've heard reports where he'll be like at meetings of the board or teleconferences with other executives, and his behavior just drifts into the bizarre. Now, this tiff between Canada and Saudi Arabia is continuing to spiral out of control. I still think Saudi Arabia greatly overreacted. Now they're saying they're going to dump Canadian assets no matter the cost. Even if they're going to lose money, they're just going to dump them. And as a result, the Canadian dollar value has dropped. Sometimes I feel like saying, children, calm down, children. Play nice. Down in Australia, apparently the NAB, which is their big health injury, they've been charging for services they never delivered. And this came from the Haine Royal Commission. I'm sorry, the NAB is the bank. And the bank admitted they were charging dead people for financial advice. People who passed away but still had active accounts, they were being charged for financial advice they never got. Are there no moral or ethical people left anywhere in the upper classes? It's amazing. Speaking of Australia, right now they have a total derivative exposure of 37 trillion with a T dollars. If that were to implode, that could collapse the entire financial system. In fact, that's the 600-pound gorilla in the living room everybody is still ignoring. The global derivatives exposure. And remember, derivatives are what caused much of the damage back in 2008. And this is one of the reasons why the economic sector does have to be regulated. They're out to make money. I don't have a problem with that. I'd like to make money. There are just certain things I won't do for it. But they're selling the derivatives left and right. And if it all comes home to roost, it could sink these companies, because derivatives, the people who sell derivatives, they're not required to keep cash reserves to cover claims the way regular insurance is. Derivatives are pretty much unregulated, and that is a problem. They're being abused. Now, we were talking about this earlier in the week. Wells Fargo is now out there saying that a computer glitch may have contributed to 400 foreclosures. And when you see all the stuff that Wells Fargo has been caught doing over the years, you have to wonder, why is it they're still in business? You know, it isn't just a few errant mistakes. It's a prolonged, ongoing campaign of malice and incompetence, matched only by Wells Fargo's fairly obvious disdain for its own customers. Jesse James was right. The real outlaws are the bankers. And whether it's Deutsche Bank or Wells Fargo, we keep seeing these stories over and over and over again, and nobody goes to jail. There'll be a wrist slap fine that the banks will make back in just a few days and take off their taxes so that ultimately you have to pick up a heavier share. Anyway, we're going to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. Alrighty, so getting on back to the news. Let's talk about immigration and the refugee crisis here. Over in Finland, their immigration service is saying they need more mental health care facilities to accommodate the increasing number of migrant patients. My question is, why are you allowing migrants with mental illness into your country in the first place? So basically, they're applying to the Ministry of the Interior for funding of an additional unit. It's amazing here. Now, up in Toronto, the government has been housing the refugees in college dormitories. The problem is that college is about to start again, and they need to move the migrants someplace else. So they're going to put them up in hotels at Canadian taxpayer expense. The problem is when they went into the dormitories after they were vacated, the places were just huge amounts of damage. And I love that quote from that member of the European Parliament the other day. If you import the third world, you get third world problems, and that's exactly what's happening here. Down in Australia, 100 African migrants attacked Melbourne's northwest Taylors Hill suburb. Just went on a rampage, throwing rocks, smashing up a police car, fighting with law enforcement. And again, it's the latest outbreak of non-white violence to sweep that city since large-scale third world refugees were allowed into that country. This is not working out. And some countries are finally starting to fight back. Down in India, they're stripping at least 4 million people, refugees, of their right to Indian citizenship, and they're deporting them to protect the ethnic Assamese people. So this is the beginning of the pushback here. Okay, now, as you know, there's been this incident where these 11 kids were found in this New Mexico enclave. It was really little more than a tent. And they've arrested some people over this. One of them is this Siraj Ibn Wahaj, and he was training these abused kids to commit mass shootings at schools. And apparently they've also found the remains of another boy on the in the compound, but they haven't been able to identify him yet. So the gun grabbers must be crying that this plan didn't go through, because nothing gets a gun grabber happier than another school shooting. Why are we letting these people into our country? This is a failed policy, and it must stop. Now, do you remember the video footage of Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney dancing and singing in his office because the city had become an official sanctuary city? So this is Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, and they terminated their information sharing contract with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. But it turns out they've been uncooperative with immigration all along. Philadelphia ignored an ICE detainer notice on an illegal alien and released him into the public. He then proceeded to rape a 13-year-old girl. So maybe it's time for the liberals to be a little bit more honest about just who it is they're offering sanctuary to. Democrats, the party of criminals and illegal immigrants here. Apparently, Nancy Pelosi is on video saying voting for Democrats gives leverage to illegal immigrants, and admits Democrats are an illegal's best friend. Now, I think at this point, very few legal immigrants or American citizens are going to want to go along with this. So this is a message definitely pitched at the illegal immigrants who are not supposed to be able to vote. But because the Democrats have managed to strike down voter ID laws pretty much across the entire country, they're getting away with it. Illegal immigrants in California, when they get their driver's license, they're registered to vote. Nobody checks their immigration status. And once that voter registration is out there, the illegal immigrant can vote, or somebody can vote on their behalf. This election system is totally messed up. So Pelosi's out there courting the illegal immigrants to come vote Democrat. They're relying on that to steal November. Now, as you know, there's been a lot of talk about police violence, and there's a new study out. Apparently it was done quite a bit of research and discovered that while police do tend to be more aggressive with blacks and Hispanics, they're more likely to shoot white people. And that's probably because of all the negative publicity that has attended a case where a police officer shoots a black suspect. But anybody who's claiming that the police are shooting more blacks than whites, they're completely wrong. If you're white, you're more likely to be shot by a cop. Now, over in Chicago, residents there are very upset with their local law enforcement because apparently the police were setting up bait trucks around neighborhoods to entice and catch thieves. And basically what it was a large truck filled with expensive shoes, Nikes. And they parked it on the street in Inglewood, a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. It's a black neighborhood, and left it open, trying to lure people into trying to steal the merchandise, at which point they could be arrested and thrown in prison. Well, I'm sorry, that's entrapment. That is clearly entrapment. And I guess the police just think that's easier. You know, it's like it's real work to go out and find real criminals. You know, we don't want to do that. We'll just set up a trap and reel them in that way here. Over at Web News, Newsys, they have an article And it's about a woman who went to Twitter to explain what mansplaining is. And she even came up with this clever flow chart, which drew a very harsh response in which she ended up being accused of sexism herself. So this chart was made up to help men steer clear of patronizing behavior, of offering information to women without being asked. That's what mansplaining is. You see a woman doing something wrong or dumb, and you try and help educate her, and the new normal is, don't you dare educate me, you're a man. You're not allowed to educate me. I want to stay stupid. I'm a liberal. Now, this one bugs me a little bit. More PC nonsense. Apparently, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is reporting that Atlanta Neighborhood Charter School has announced there will be no more Pledge of Allegiance to start the school day. And the reason given is that more and more people were choosing not to stand or recite the pledge. And rather than try and rebuild a sense of patriotic feeling in the students, they just gave up. So no more Pledge of Allegiance. I remember the big fight over prayer in school, how long that one went on here. Okay, here's another story, more PC stuff. This has to do with Planet Fitness, which is this chain of health clubs across the country here. And it tells the story of a woman who went to her local Planet Fitness to work out, which she does many days of the week. When she went into the women's locker room to change, there was a young man standing there putting on makeup as he looked in the mirror. Now, thinking he'd walked into the wrong locker room by mistake, the woman asked him why he was there, pointing out that he was a man, but was in the women's changing area. And the man did not reply. So the woman went to talk to the manager, who informed her that this man identified as a woman, and by Planet Fitness policy, he was allowed to use the ladies' locker room. Now, when the woman explained she was not comfortable changing in the presence of a man, she was told she would have to wait. And she waited for roughly an hour. When she went back into the locker room, he was still inside. And the upshot of this whole issue is she got kicked out of Planet Fitness. She was made to feel like she was the criminal, and that this man in the women's locker room was the victim. So it's silly. It is just silly. We have another case of civil forfeiture. Remember earlier in the week I reported using civil forfeiture, the police are now stealing more from the American people than burglars do. So basically, there's this guy, Edward Phipps, and during a traffic stop in 2016, the cops basically found a bag full of $46,000 in the trunk. Now, police brought in a drug sniffing dog, which came up empty. So even though the Justice Department has presented no evidence of any criminal act, police took the money, and federal prosecutors declared their intent to force the forfeiture of the funds so they could keep it. Now, Phipps came forward to say basically the cash was his and that it was obtained legally. So the end of it is that Edwin Phipps has agreed to let the federal prosecutors keep most of the money so he can get back what's left over, even though he did not commit any crime. This happened up in New Hampshire. The motto of the state is live free or die. Almost makes me ashamed to be from the Granite State here. A little bit of good news here on Hawaii. First of all, as I mentioned to that caller earlier, Hurricane Harvey just swept on by. We got a little wind, a little rain, no big deal. It's well out to sea. Hurricane Christy is definitely tracking north and will not come anywhere near us here. Down on the volcano, the U.S. Geological Survey is saying that the volcanic activity is definitely slowing, and it may be entering a pause. There's been a significant reduction in lava from Fissure 8. There's been no activity at the summit of Kilauea outside of a few random rock falls. And the USGS is saying that eruptions can wax and wane or pause completely, and they're not ruling out a return to high levels of lava discharge or new outbreaks. But at the moment, it does seem to have slowed on down. Kim.com has come on out basically saying Hollywood has always been a propaganda and recruitment tool for the Pentagon. And I remember when the movie Top Gear came out and enlistment in the Navy just skyrocketed. Everybody wanted to be a Tomcat pilot. Earlier in the week, we had this article on whatreallyhappened.com about all the movies that have been made, hundreds and hundreds of them, that involved communication with the U.S. government to basically decide what was going to be in them for you to see. All right, now it's time to talk about Alex Jones and the attack on the independent media here. And the latest thing coming out from the liberals on this is that anybody who's defending or basically complaining about InfoWars deplatforming is simply defending Alex Jones. Oh, you're defending that guy who's got all these crazy conspiracy theories. No, we're defending freedom of speech. We're defending the First Amendment. We're pointing out we're on a slippery slope of internet censorship. And the internet has become critical to the public discourse of political affairs, not to mention health and safety news, which is why they wanted to go away. Meanwhile, over at Facebook, Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan's official Facebook page is just full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and hateful speech, which apparently is perfectly okay with Facebook. They haven't deplatformed him. And apparently Farrakhan claimed that Jews are secretly controlling government agencies to suppress black Americans. Jews are weaponizing marijuana with chemicals to feminize black men. Which is why I don't go to Farrakhan's page. But it underscores the fact Alex Jones was targeted for speaking truth to power. Now, the good news is that Alex Jones followers are finding other ways to get around this. The official InfoWars app, a lot of people are getting that now, and apparently 6 million people have now subscribed to the InfoWars newsletter in the last 48 hours. So they're finding a way around the silicon wall that's being put up here. Meanwhile, alternative social media platforms like BitChute and Gab are rising. They're getting new users. And by the way, InfoWars videos are now available on Real Video and on BitChute. So everybody's starting to move to these new platforms, and I'm getting ready to move to a new platform. I'm going to get rid of this YouTube feed, which I'm getting complaints that it's poor quality and a lot of buffering, and it's being messed with here. Over at Amazon.com, as you know, Alex Jones sells a lot of products linked to InfoWars. And Amazon used to have a choice recommendation on his products. That's now been removed. And Amazon has never really said how it determines which products receive the accolade. It appears to be very, very arbitrary. So Amazon is out there joining with the pounding on Alex Jones. All right, we're coming up on another commercial break here, and the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, and we'll be right back. And aloha America, welcome back to the show here, and we're talking about this deplatforming and banning by the social media, which is basically taking away from you your right to decide for yourself what you want to read, see, or hear. And it's being transferred to corporations that are very much in bed with the government and other corporations. That's dictatorship. Now, apparently, Facebook suspended the Natural News account for posting an historical quote from Mahatma Gandhi. Now, the quote reads, Among the many misdeeds of British rule in India, history will look back upon the act depriving a whole nation of arms as the blackest. And apparently this historical quote was apparently too much for Facebook censors to bear. So apparently the gun grabbers are now getting in on this act and saying, no, 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 you can't have anything that's pro-gun. Can't do that. You really can't do that. Now, it's probably going to surprise a lot of people that Gandhi wrote that in his autobiography. But the reality is that while he wanted peace, he thought people should be armed and should be prepared to do violence. In fact, another quote that he had was that if you are given a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. So part of Gandhi that a lot of people don't know about. But again, Facebook has now issued a final warning to Natural News saying that one more and they'll be banned permanently. Apparently, Jimmy Dore is now banned as well. And he makes a good point. This is like AT&T shutting off your phone because they don't like what you said. And that's exactly what's going on here. Now it's going a little bit over the top here. Apparently, Democrats are now saying it's time to stamp out Fox News. I mean, this is getting into Stalin territory here. And this is a new leap for the left. The Democrats and the corporate media want Fox News eliminated from Facebook, the largest and most successful news organization in America today. They want all conservative publishers banned from the social media platform. The answer to that is stop using that platform. Now, Facebook hasn't banned me because I don't use it. Twitter hasn't banned me because I don't use it. I'm starting to use these alternatives, like Gab. But this is getting really, really dangerous. And I don't understand why Donald Trump is not getting involved in this. He has to know it was the independent media that made the difference between him winning and losing in 2016. And now he seems to be turning his back on us all. We're going to take a break for station identification. Back with hour number 3 after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And we're going to go ahead and take a phone call from Jim in New York. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Mike. I have a theory about Antifa. I think Antifa works for the CIA and the feds. And they have multiple reasons. So one, it's to discourage all forms of protests, including future anti-war protests. And I think they're all, pretty much all federal operatives. And it's to get people hating Antifa. So then, in the fall, if there's a war with Iran, any anti-war protester will be tied in with Antifa, who is so hated as it is. What do you think of that theory?
It's going to be very hard to link anti-war protesters with Antifa, and while I'm sure there's a lot of government involvement in this, I think it's really more political. It's about stirring up race hatred, getting us to fight amongst ourselves so we don't stand up to the government, and along with just it's brown shirt tactics against conservatives and Trump supporters.
Yes. Yes, it's, middle America. I mean, if they go out and counter protest, I mean, they could go to jail. The guy in Charlottesville, this man, Jacob Goodwin, did you ever hear him?
No, I have not.
He was at Charlottesville protesting, taking down the monuments, and he got in a fist fight with one of these leftist groups, and he's facing 20 years in prison for a fist fight.
Yeah, that's...
Look him up, Jacob Goodwin. So that's a message to any American who wants to protest. I think part of it's just they don't want people protesting.
Well, you remember that?
You go ahead.
Do you remember over at Berkeley that associate professor who like beat up 8 people with a bicycle lock? He got a wrist slap.
Well, because he's
liberal,
a leftist, and he's maybe he's a government operative. So, but I think that's the message being sent. Don't you dare protest. 20 years for a simple 2 young guys having a fist fight. And he's facing 20 years. They tacked on a hate crime charge and all this stuff. It's Trump should pardon anyone. He should pardon Jacob Goodwin. That's just disgraceful. He's in trial right now.
Yeah, I wish Trump would like get out his little pardon pen and pardon Julian Assange, not to mention Leonard Peltier and Mumia al-Jabal. But Trump...
Well, Assange
seems to be
Australian.
Say again?
And Assange is an Australian, so he should have the U.S. should have no jurisdiction over him.
Well, if he's inside the U.S. has jurisdiction. And it's no secret the U.S. wants to get him to make an example of him or to silence him about the truth behind the DNC hack. But I'm glad those senators want to talk to him about that and find it on out, because there's no way it was a hack. The metadata on those files prove that.
Right. Well, that's all I wanted to say. I think Antifa, they're all government operatives, and I love your program, and I tell everyone about it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and we're going to switch over to Patrick in England. Aloha, Patrick. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, just hello, Mike. Just really talk about alternative hosting platforms and things, because obviously in the wake of what's been happening, and obviously alternative social media. Because when you actually think about it, all the platforms that are used now as mainstream platforms, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, they were all once upon a time private little corporations. And the problem is, how can we stop a new person that's setting up a new video platform once they get 100,000 viewers or members, whatever they may be, whether they're a Facebook type of organization or a social media or a video hosting platform. What the problem is, what's stopping them from setting out a big corporation? Microsoft comes along, Bill Gates, I'll make you a millionaire overnight, sell to me, and they then sell out to the big corporates, and they then become part of all the same problem that we've got now. They start becoming hooked up with the governments and the mainstream corporate media, and they start banning people. YouTube were all little businesses once upon a time, weren't they? So what can we do to stop the new hosting platforms and social media coming up now selling out to the big corporates later on when they start getting too many members?
Well, a lot of these new social media platforms are being set up as peer-to-peer operations rather than having centralized servers. So there's really nothing for somebody to come on in and say, we want to buy the company, because the social media is basically diffused across the internet itself. And I think that's a really good idea, and I'm basically focusing on these new social media that are using peer-to-peer and no centralized control.
Well, yeah, didn't some of the music platforms like that, or once like that, LimeWire, and they got outlawed? I mean, there still has to be, even with the peer-to-peer, with my basic knowledge of networks, there's still got to be some kind of lead machine or some sort of machine within that peer-to-peer that's acting as a server or some sort of control master.
No, the peer-to-peer doesn't work like that. Peer-to-peer means that files are on machines all over the membership and the users group. Now, the peer-to-peer music sharing sites were shut down because of copyright violation. From the music industry. But again, we've got to find a solution. We may be reduced to, using mailing lists to get the information on out there. Or even push comes to shove, fax machines like the Soviet citizens did.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the problem is with the video hosting platform, if video posting new platform is going to work on peer-to-peer, that means that each new member has got to agree to act as a kind of server, and they've got to have, like, hundreds of terabytes of storage at their home. I mean, that's going to cost them a fortune, which means that video platform, there will have to be some sort of centralized system for that.
No,
and
again,
stopping them?
You'd have, a couple of videos on this machine, a couple of videos on that machine, a couple of videos on that machine, and basically the system would basically, find its way to the correct video to play it on the screen. I mean, Skype originally started that way. Then they went with a centralized cloud server, and their service really went downhill, which is why we're using Twitch on this setup here. But it can be made to work. Ultimately, though, if we go with one of these new startup companies and they start to get big and we read the business section and we find out they're being bought, then we go and we find another one. We're just going to have to be flexible and be adaptable.
Yeah, but if these little ones, they start getting too big, the owners could even be threatened. You sell to us, we'll make you $1 million overnight, by the way. You sell to us, we'll pay you a huge amount of money, we'll make you $1 million overnight, and you agree not to talk about it. And then it becomes part of a giant corporation that's then hooked up with the government and the global elites and all that sort of stuff, and we lose our independence on the hosting platform. That's just all concerns me. And also these little search engines, what's stopping them from, they start getting too many searches, whatever, and the big corporates starting to notice, they come along, find out who the owners, we'll bail you out overnight, we'll make you $1 million overnight.
Patrick, are you honestly saying that you don't think we should be trying to find a new way to communicate with our fellow citizens?
Yeah, yes, I do. Yes, I do, and of course. But then at the same time, to think of a foolproof way that those little platforms and things can be protected, and the people not to sell out, or if it can be done on a peer-to-peer basis.
Well, after what just happened to Alex Jones and Jimmy Dore and so many of these other sites, people going to the new search engines, people going to these other social media platforms, they're going to be very sensitive. And if they detect that there's any kind of shadow banning going on, they'll just go to other social media platforms and say, hey, over here, they're starting to get into bad habits. Frankly, I think it's time. Yeah, I think it's time for the monopoly of these. There's a trust, basically a trust between these companies. And Donald Trump ought to do like Teddy Roosevelt, who was known as the trust buster. And I think it would be better for everybody if instead of just the big three, Facebook, Google, and YouTube, that there were dozens and dozens out there. And I'm sure that people would come up with little, ways to look at information from all of them at the same time. But we're going to find a way.
What happened to MySpace?
We're going to find a way. Well, they just went out of business.
And there was Friends Reunited, wasn't there? And
they went out of business.
Yeah, they were once. Yeah.
Yeah, they went broke.
That's right.
And some of these new startup social media sites have in fact gone out of business. But I think right now it's a really good climate because of what these big tech monopolies have done. That it's going to be a lot easier for these alternative platforms to gain users and to even find funding to get this built up. We will find a way, though, Patrick. I'm a lot more optimistic about this than you are. Anyway, thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go.
Well, thank you.
And we're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. And we're talking about this war on the independent media being carried out by deplatforming various conservatives. And it's clearly targeted on conservatives. Now, interestingly enough, the Neo-Conservative Weekly Standard is saying big tech should ban more people. And there's no reason conservatives should be defending Alex Jones. Well, as I said earlier, we're not necessarily defending Alex Jones. We're defending our right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. We have a constitutional right to freedom of speech, and we have the right to peaceably assemble. That's also in that First Amendment. And what Facebook and YouTube and Google are now doing is they're depriving us of our right to peacefully assemble on the internet and discuss our grievances. There has to be a major lawsuit about this, and it's probably going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, where somebody needs to set the policy that these search engines, social media platforms have no more right to censor speech than, as Jimmy Dore said, the phone company. Now, apparently, there is now a call for the CEO of Twitter to testify before Congress on the practice of shadow banning. And I'm sure the Democrats are going to be fighting it tooth and nail. But every conservative member of Congress, every Republican there has to understand this is a threat to their position. This is a threat to their office. And they need to be doing something about this right now. Over in Vietnam, there's a new cybersecurity law that requires internet companies to scrub critical content and hand over user data if Vietnam's communist government demands it. In other words, they're banning criticism of the government over there. So, what are the Vietnam computer users doing? They're going over to a different system. And it's called Mines. And that's how they're going to get around the tough internet controls. People will find a way. People want to have the truth. They don't want to be lied to. The only reason the corporate media and the government got away with lying to us for so long is we didn't realize it was happening. Propaganda only works if the people being propagandized don't know it's going on. And then they just sort of accept what they're being told. That's gone. The American people now know the government and the corporate media have been lying. And they want to know the truth. They know that their future depends on getting to that truth. Whether it's knowing what medications are safe to use and which are not, what foods are safe to eat and which are not, how best to prepare for an economic downturn in the face of a government that continues to lie about the economic indicators. People want that truth. They need that truth. Like I said, remember what happened in the former Soviet Union? They were using fax machines to just fax articles. Somebody would write an article, put it in the fax machine, send it to 10 pre-programmed numbers. The people at the receiving end would take that article, stick it back in the fax machine, send it out to another 10 pre-programmed numbers, and it would just spread all over the Soviet Union. Now, it wasn't as fast as the internet, but most articles got from one end of the Soviet Union to the other in a matter of just a few days. And it was because of this samizdat the Soviet people came to understand their government was lying to them. And we know what happened to the Soviet Union since then. Now, getting on back to Gab. Gab, I think, made a bad decision. They set up their social media platform on Microsoft Azure, who is now threatening to shut Gab down over offensive posts. Why you would have gone with Microsoft, anything with Microsoft, you know, you really do need to have your own server. You really do have to have your own server. But anything with Microsoft, yeah, they're going to mess around with it here. But what's going on here is very simple. Democrats are all about silencing their opponents, not arguing with them, not having discussions. They're becoming elitist. They just want to silence their opponents, whether it's deplatforming critics on the internet or sending out Antifa to attack Trump supporters. It's brown shirt tactics. Now, there was this Democratic senator, and I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he came on out and basically said survival of our democracy depends on banning sites like InfoWars. And maybe the reason that Trump isn't doing anything about this crisis is they are acting so crazy. It is having a negative effect on them. By the way, I just saw a story whiz by here. The latest polls are showing that despite all the illegal immigration stuff going on here, the Democrats are losing support among Hispanics, mostly due to the unemployment. Now, democracy requires the people to be fully informed and to make good decisions on election day. That comes right from Thomas Jefferson himself. He said it was the highest duty of the American people to keep themselves fully informed so that they can make good choices. And what Facebook and Google and YouTube are trying to do is prevent you from being fully informed. They want to make sure you only get one side of the argument. That's what's going on here. Talk about being un-American. And that's clearly what they are. No respect for the Bill of Rights. No respect for Thomas Jefferson. It's just we want what we want when we want it here. Anyway, article by Dr. James Dobson basically saying that a lot of people have looked back at Nazi Germany and said, how did the Nazis get away with it? How did they take a nation of basically moral, ethical people and create such a monstrosity? And Dobson is saying the Nazi success was made possible by one primary factor. It was their complete and utter control of the means of communication. There was no internet or television at that time, but they did have radio, and it was very effective, especially Hitler's national broadcasts. And what was interesting is the radios were built with government subsidies, and they were designed so that they could only tune in the German radio stations. You couldn't tune in something coming in from other countries. Back then, the shortwave band was basically broken up by country. Everybody got a block of frequencies and they used them. And these radios only listened to the German channels here. So they had newspapers, films, remember Lena Riefenstahl? And the German people believed it. And they got manipulated into ultimately losing their country. All right, we're going to take another break for commercials. We've got a caller on the line, and we will be right back. And Aloha America, welcome back to our show. We're going to go back to the phone lines here to Fred in Michigan. Aloha, Fred. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Leila earlier caused me to recall Allison Ware's presentation at Berkeley a year ago, entitled Allison Ware, WEIR, yes. 2017, 100 Years of Pro-Israel Activism. Now, Allison Ware is one of the original Peace Corps volunteers. And with all this genocidal morass occurring over there in Israel, and all of the Talmudic Jewish media outlets are always condemning the so-called belligerents and insurgents as the instigators. You see, they fire off their bottle rockets, and somehow magically they wind up over in Israeli territory.
Yes.
And that, of course, justifies sniping children in the heads, in the limbs, in the backs, whatever moves the courageous idea, swine scum, to do what they do.
Okay.
So this presentation by Allison Ware is all about that, and way more. And it is on YouTube, and she was sponsored by some very honorable, patriotic Americans at the University of California, Berkeley, a year ago. Okay. Now, Joe called in earlier, as I recall, and you had an exchange with him involving partially the NASA space program. And that tweaked my recall of a presentation on YouTube by a UK, I think he's a professor of physics, maybe whatever. It's called Better Mankind. That's the YouTube channel, Better Mankind. The subject matter of it, as you remember, there was the big 49th anniversary of the 20th of July, 69 Apollo moon landing, right?
Right.
Only I didn't hear anything about it. I didn't hear anything about the 49th commemoration. So at that presentation by that UK professor, Better Mankind, you will hear, and the title of it is NASA admits we, or they, or whatever, NASA admits never gone to the moon. And it presents NASA astronauts at this very moment in time within the last couple of years, relative to the new Orion space capsule project.
Fred, before we go any further, are you referring to the video that is supposed to be of Buzz Aldrin saying that they never went to the moon? Because I know Buzz, that's not him.
No.
Okay, Fred, you need to understand. You need to understand this kind of stuff is being put out on the net to make us look bad, to delegitimize us. Okay, now I worked on Apollo.
Are talking about.
Okay,
these
Fred.
Astronauts are talking.
Okay, thank you. We're going to let you go here. We're going to let you go. Thank you very much. Now, I worked on Apollo 12 post mission, basically grinding up moon rocks and hitting them with protons. It was called proton luminescence. It was a way of measuring how long the surface of the moon had been relatively undisturbed except for micrometeorites at the Apollo 12 site. If the Apollo landings were fake, why would NASA have gone through all that? It's not like I was on TV or anything. You know, it was just, you know, small little lab at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. You know, so there's another issue as well, and that was that during all the Apollo launches, that same night following the launch, anybody with a decent astronomical telescope could actually see the vehicles heading to the moon. You'd see the S4B booster, you'd see the 4 tumbling panels of the launch adapter, and then you'd see the Apollo lunar module command module pair heading on out there. And don't forget, all those Apollo missions left on the moon what was called a lunar laser ranging retroreflector. And you can still use those today. And they're still being used today. Even Mythbusters went on out and did this experiment where, you know, you can bounce lasers off of these reflective devices and get a very accurate measure to the distance of the moon. But this kind of stuff is being deliberately put out on the independent media to try and make us look silly and kooky and weird. And that's why things like, you know, chemtrails and fake Apollo moon landing and the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot's love child are basically subjects that we don't get into on this radio show. So anyway, and by the way, there is a video going around purporting to be of Buzz Aldrin admitting they didn't go to the moon. And I knew Buzz, and that's not him. Anyway, going to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And I got a little bit more information about what's going on between Microsoft and Gab. And apparently it came down to 2 posts that were posted by a user, which frankly, looking at them, I find them offensive myself. And we have to go back to being civil. When we talk about having, you know, freedom of speech and the ability to gather peacefully and express our grievances, it has to be done politely and civilly. Explosive rhetoric does nobody any good. And unfortunately, people who are operating websites or social media, they do have to be careful because it's very easy for somebody who wants to shut down a social media platform to basically create multiple accounts and start posting all kinds of vile stuff and then immediately turn around and say, oh, look at all the vile stuff on this system, you got to take it down. Gab really ought to have their own servers. Then they don't have to go along with Microsoft policy. You know, people try and post questionable stuff on my website all the time. I'm having to delete it. But I mean, this is a full-on war, and right now, one of the tactics they're going to use is to try and, you know, post deliberately inflammatory materials on websites where they can, or to call into radio shows with nonsense about fake Apollo moon landings and killer bees and all the rest of that stuff. So, getting on back to what's going on with the deplatforming here. Now, Ezra Levant, who's the CEO of Rebel Media, was being interviewed by Paul Joseph Watson. And he basically said, it's time for Trump to bust up the monopolies, and if he doesn't, they will bust him. And he's absolutely right. They're out to get rid of Donald Trump. In fact, I was looking on Fox News here, and they apparently had a quote from Thomas Friedman, who's saying the corporate media has to band together to go after Trump. They're not even trying to hide their bias and prejudice anymore. So another article, this one from Information Clearinghouse, Apple, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter subvert the U.S. Constitution, free speech, and American liberty. And that's exactly what they're doing. And they are a monopoly. They are a trust. And they should be broken up. We need dozens and dozens of social media platforms that are out there so that we can pick and choose and always make sure that we're on one that is, respects the First Amendment. Now, apparently, Jared Holt over at Right Wing Watch is now taking credit for deplatforming InfoWars. And Right Wing Watch is funded by George Soros. Now, what's really interesting is on their About page, they say the Soros-funded group is a project of People for the American Way dedicated to monitoring and exposing the activities and rhetoric of right-wing activists and organizations in order to expose their extreme agenda People for the American Way says it is a progressive advocacy organization founded to fight right-wing extremism and to, quote, defend constitutional values, including free expression. Talk about lying through their teeth. Now, the right wing are not the ones who are being extremists. The right wing wants this country to go back to being the way it was. The right wing wants the Constitution as the law of the land. And it's very alarming how many Democrats are starting to come out of the woodwork and say, well, we can't have judges just going along with what that Constitution says. They absolutely hate it. They hate the Bill of Rights. It's all been under attack. The Fourth Amendment is under attack. The Fifth Amendment under attack. They've been attacking the Second Amendment for decades, and now the First Amendment's under attack. But we will find a way to get around this, just like the Soviets did. Another article, this one coming out of Chuck Baldwin Live, saying that we're already engaged in our second Civil War. And that decades-old left-right, conservative, liberal, Democrat-Republican paradigm that had almost evaporated is back with a vengeance. And it's turned into a full-fledged war. And it doesn't matter which side wins the war. Constitutional government and the natural rights of man are the losers. And it is already turning violent. That's what Antifa is doing. The liberals want the conservatives to just go away so they can create their liberal paradise, like we've seen them do in places like Baltimore and Chicago. Another article from Information Clearinghouse, institutionalizing intolerance. Bullies win, freedom suffers when we can't agree to disagree. And this gets back to what I was saying before. We have to be civil. We have to have our debates in a calm voice, without extremist rhetoric. Just put out the ideas and argue the ideas. Argue the facts, logic, and law. The people resorting to violence, like the liberals, Antifa, do so because they know they can't win the debate on facts, logic, and law. So their tactics are to basically attack Trump supporters or conservatives in general and to try and silence dissent by attacking the independent media. Over at Rolling Stone, Matt Taibbi has an article saying, beware the slippery slope of Facebook censorship. And Basically, Facebook claimed that these accounts that were shut down sought to inflame social and political tensions in the United States, and said their activity was similar to that of Russian accounts during the 2016 election. So they're back to this whole Russia thing. And he goes on to say the death pit for civil liberties is usually found in a combination of fringe, unpopular people or ideas and a national security emergency. And again, I'm very surprised that Trump isn't taking an interest in this. He has to know the independent media were essential to his defeating Hillary Clinton in 2016. And now it's like he's turned his back on us all. Could care less. Alex Jones put out a video specifically asking Donald Trump, you've got to come on in here and get involved and restore freedom of speech, you know, to social media. Now, back in 2016, we posted this flashback article from The Intercept. And back in 2016, Facebook was admitting they were deleting accounts at the direction of the US and Israeli governments. So this is just more of the same here. Now, as we reported earlier in the week, Facebook now wants your bank records. And they say that it's going to be because they want to offer smartphone banking through the Facebook Messenger app. But frankly, given all of this deplatforming, I don't want to be part of that. Because Facebook is going to wind up with a Chinese-style social credit system where Facebook could basically deny you a bank account or a home if you don't hold the right political views. Man, we are so far down the road into fascism. Sometimes I just throw up my hands in despair here. Over at YouTube, they're starting to basically insert articles about human-caused global warming below any video that questions human-caused global warming. Now remember, Soros was already out there saying that Facebook should shut down the page of anybody who questions human-caused global warming. You're not allowed to question that. So basically, YouTube will grab information from Wikipedia or Britannica Encyclopedia to basically put out messages saying, yes, human-caused global warming is very real and you were being a silly person to even watch this video. And again, we're not talking about defending Alex Jones or defending Jimmy Dore or defending the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute. We're defending freedom of speech. We're defending the Bill of Rights. That's what this is all about. We're on the cusp of tyranny with all of this. We're just going to have to find a way to get around it. And I do wish Trump would get involved, but it seems like he's so caught up with his sanctions war and wars in other countries. When it comes to what's going on inside the United States, he almost seems asleep at the switch. As somebody pointed out the other day, despite all the rhetoric about it, the wall isn't getting built. And the illegal immigrants are still pouring in. They're still being registered to vote. Okay. Now, we were talking about artificial intelligence the other day, where what they mean by artificial intelligence today is software that can learn on its own within a limited context problem. The idea of artificial intelligence that's self-aware and able to pass the Turing test, that's called generalized artificial intelligence. That's still a very, very long way off. And I made the comment the other day that the Weather Channel uses IBM's Watson, where supposedly it should learn from its mistaken forecasts. But as time seems to go on, it seems to get worse and worse and less accurate. And there's a real danger. We don't understand what's going on inside these AIs. They could just head off in a bad direction and nobody would pick it up for a long time. And apparently there's been a problem over in hospitals who have been using Watson for diagnoses. And the hospitals have ended their experiments with the platform, arguing it doesn't help diagnose or treat diseases. It's coming up wrong a lot. Now, apparently over in China, they've got one that diagnoses brain cancers that actually does seem to work really well. But here in the U.S., Watson apparently wasn't really doing very well in these hospital situations. And I don't want an artificially intelligent system diagnosing me anyway. Not that the human doctors are all that good. Years ago when I had my illness, the reason it was so serious is I got 2 misdiagnoses in a row before they finally figured out what was going on. First, they told me it was an upper respiratory infection. Then they told me I had cancer. That was a real dark moment to go through. Then they came on in and said, oh, it's not cancer, it's a pneumonia. Maybe they took a look at my bank account and realized they couldn't make any money off of me for cancer treatment here. Now, here is something that's going on, and I think it illustrates that Americans are becoming very self-absorbed, very vain. I look at all these selfie sticks where everybody wants to be a media star. And it reinforces the idea that people's appearance is all that really matters, and what's inside doesn't count, which may be a big reason why we've lost our moral and ethical compasses here. But apparently, plastic surgeons are raising concerns over a trend that's popping up, where patients are pursuing plastic surgery so that they can resemble how they see themselves in Snapchat or Facetune filters. Now, I'm assuming that what they mean here is that Snapchat or Facetune, when you take a picture, it will clean it up automatically. And I've seen similar apps available for the iPhone. I don't use them. I don't do selfies. I've only ever taken one selfie in my life, and that was to let a listener know that I was actually wearing the T-shirt that he'd sent me. So apparently 3 dermatologists from the Boston University School of Medicine and Boston Medical Center wrote an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association talking about facial plastic surgery, in which they said social media is altering people's perception of what is beautiful. And they dubbed the phenomenon Snapchat dysmorphia, where patients are trying to get plastic surgery to look like the filtered versions of themselves instead, with fuller lips, bigger eyes, or a thinner nose. Okay, so I guess these filters actually smoosh things around. And they say it's alarming because those filtered selfies often present an unattainable look, and they're blurring the line of reality and fantasy for these patients. Now, personally, I think the idea of plastic surgery is absurd unless you've had an injury where there needs to be some repair. But just the idea of going into a hospital because you think it's going to make you look more beautiful, when you look at the fact that, doctors are killing more Americans than assault weapons are by a huge, huge rate. We need to go back to just loving ourselves and accepting ourselves as we are, as the universe made us. If you're all about appearances and everything, I can imagine why in our present culture there is such a divorce problem. Because a man and a woman will look at each other, they'll like what they see, they get married, but as the looks fade with age, the marriage starts to fall apart because there's nothing else there. Now, fortunately, in Claire, in my case, we were actually friends before we got married. And I think she's beautiful no matter what. And hopefully we'll go back to that. I don't need her to have plastic surgery. And I'm not going to do plastic surgery for her. There's a risk there. There's in my mind, unjustifiable risk. But the American people have been encouraged not just by social media, but by cosmetics and fashion advertising, to think their appearance is everything. We're turning into a vain culture with no internal values anymore. And I think it's a big reason we're in the mess that we're in. Japan has banned the MMR vaccine, and they introduced it back in 1989. More about this when we come back from these words from our sponsors. And aloha America, welcome back to our show, final segment of our program today here. And we're talking about the Japanese government banning the MMR vaccine. And if you've seen the movie Vaxxed or read some of the other reports, the concern is that putting all 3 vaccines into a single shot may be the cause of the problem, and that the individual single shots don't seem to have as many adverse reactions. But apparently the pharmaceutical companies think that it's cheaper to just make it into one shot to save money. So basically, back in 1989, the MMR vaccine was introduced in Japan. Parents who refused the compulsory vaccine were fined. After just 3 months of analysis, officials realized that 1 out of every 900 children developed serious adverse reactions to the vaccine, a rate that was 2,000 times higher than the expected rate. And 4 years later, the government removed the MMR mandate against measles and rubella, and basically said that they were concerned about the MMR vaccine causing additional cases of mumps, citing numerous studies in The Lancet. All righty. We've been talking about the opioid crisis, where there's plenty of opium flowing out of Afghanistan. It's very inexpensive. It's flowing into the streets of America and flowing into the pharmaceutical industries. And as a result, we have a lot of people who are now addicted to these pills, and a lot of overdose deaths. And it turns out a quarter of the opioid deaths in Massachusetts turned out to be people working in construction who get injured on the job, because it's a very dangerous job, but they're under pressure to keep working even though they're in pain. So they start taking the opioids, and they keep taking more and more of them. And that leads to an overdose death here. Okay, now then, final closing story here. Remember Margot Kidder? She played Lois Lane opposite Christopher Reeves in the Superman movies, and we had reported earlier in the year that she'd passed away. It turned out that it's been declared a suicide, a self-inflicted drug and alcohol overdose. She was 69 years old. And I'd actually been corresponding with Margot. I had contacted her over this amazing article she wrote about the current state of the United States. And to my surprise, she got back to me, and we corresponded quite a bit back and forth. She was supposed to come on the radio show. We were never able to make that work on out. So it's kind of sad to see her go. But apparently she was just struggling with all kinds of depression, bipolar disorder. Whether or not she was on medication, I don't know. Whether the medication actually made things worse or better, I don't know. But it troubles me. It does. Anyway, there's the music. Time for me to get on out of here. Get something useful done with the rest of the day. Stay tuned for John Stedmiller. I'm sure he's got a lot to share with you. Please take what you learn here at Republic Broadcasting and whatreallyhappened.com and share it with everyone that you can, especially this issue about the big corporate social media starting to ban sites left and right. In fact, Facebook is now scrubbing their website of 3D gun plans. So they're just on this censorship streak. We need to let everybody know this is going on. So tell all your friends, email them, talk to them face to face. This is about as un-American as a corporation can get. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.